Hello and welcome. My name is Aarrnesh Kapoor and I'm the International Students Representative at the Students Association. The University of Edinburgh is home to over 25,000 international students from over 160 countries. We form around 50% of Edinburgh's total student numbers. However, our cohort-specific needs are often overlooked and our voices underrepresented. We are here today to try and change that. I'm delighted to have with me today Professor Colm Harmon, Vice Principal Students at the University of Edinburgh, for a wide-ranging chat on issues affecting international students. Would you like to introduce yourself, Colm?
Yeah, thanks, Aarrnesh. And hi, everybody. I'm Colm Harmon. I'm Vice Principal Students, as Aarrnesh says, and I'm also a Professor of Economics at the university. I've been with the university just over 5 years, joining just before the pandemic, so have had an easy, fun time as Vice Principal since then. Before that, I was at the University of Sydney, and before that, University College Dublin, which is what remains of my accent, which is Irish.
Thank you, Colm. I want to begin this interview by addressing the omnipresent narrative around international students being cash cows for the United Kingdom economy and for the university. In 2023, a report found that the economic impact of international students at this university was £1.8 billion per annum. Why do you think this perception exists? Is it correct? And what is the University of Edinburgh doing to change that?
Well, the perception is a difficult one. I mean, the cash cow is an awful kind of language, but it is also indisputably true that the way in which higher education finance in the UK, and indeed most countries now, is built is on a combination of domestic student fees, international student fees, and research income is primarily the three sources. And the UK, in line with many other places, are not fully funded for the research component, and in that the research charities and the national research funders don't give appropriate overheads for the cost of the research. So when you see the great things that a university like Edinburgh produces, they're produced with a subsidy from the other parts of the university's operation. And that's the student side. And in the case of UK and indeed Edinburgh, the domestic student, both Scottish and UK undergrad, certainly, also operate at a loss, if we could use that language. Profit and loss is not the language of a charity, which is what the university is, but for the sake of simplification, that's the way I'll phrase it. So, we for every undergraduate student, the gap between our cost of provision and the combination of fees or contribution from government is many thousands of pounds.
Yeah.
So the only cohort that, and indeed the only part of the operation where we can charge what we would consider to be sort of full economic cost is the international student.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of facts of the position. It's unfortunate to kind of characterize it in the sense of the sort of that somehow that's exploited, but it is indisputably true that it is one of the parts of our operations where we have the ability to charge the full economic cost, and if we didn't, we would have substantive challenges. So you're right in the sense that international student revenue to the organisation is a hugely valuable source of revenue, as it is to the sector. But that said, the balance by which we approach both student numbers and the quantum, as well as the costs, maybe are not as kind of cavalier as the sort of the cash cow language would suggest. And in particular, if it was just a case of that, we would we have a lot more demand than we have places, so we could certainly have more. And we probably have the ability to charge more, if I'm honest, in terms of the way our market is. And that's a position that Edinburgh has not exploited, I would say.
That segues well into what I was going to ask you next, Professor. In February this year, the University of Edinburgh announced its intent to cut £140 million of expenditure. The principal partly attributed this to a reduction in attractiveness of the UK as a destination for international students. Edinburgh's international student numbers have only increased despite overall numbers decreasing in Scotland. Can you elaborate on how Edinburgh's financial position will impact its international students moving forward?
Well, I mean, the impact is sort of several layers to that. One I think is on, as I said, in terms of the quantum. We have a guidance in terms of our overall aspirations in terms of our size and shape. We haven't sought to change that too much. You're right, actually. Edinburgh is one of the few institutions that has had a relatively good performance in the student recruitment market. What's the issue in relation to the financial question is that we build our budgets on one assumption, and our expenditure plans for the next year are based on those. And when you fall short, which we did, so we're more than we had the previous, but less than we had budgeted for. And what that means for Edinburgh in particular is that when you have an institution that costs, 100 million plus a month just to open the doors, you don't have a lot of wriggle room, despite what people might think in terms of our balance of revenue and costs. So I think, while we've had, unlike other institutions, on the other hand, have had an implosion in their markets, and that has caused all their revenue to fall away, and that's why they're not meeting their costs. In many ways, Edinburgh's problem is as much a question of the costs of the operation have increased over the last 5 to 7 years, and the revenue base is probably kind of at an equilibrium. And that would be my kind of second part of the response in terms of, I think where we're at is we kind of know the number of students that we can get, assuming that we don't lower the quality bar, which is really important. The brand of being a student at Edinburgh only rests upon us having amazing students, which, without wishing to sound patronizing, you really are amazing students, all of you, international or otherwise, and not moving from that dictum. So we're committed to sort of the quality of our student body, and that means we're committed to having a bar drawn in terms of admitting students, and that'll mean we have to adjust our cost base to reflect that. I think that's the second part of the question about impact.
Yeah.
Look, I think we have, to use the principal's language, nothing is off the table in terms of working your way through. That said, we've made considerable strides in revising and upgrading and rethinking the student experience at Edinburgh generally, and we have a lot of work to do. We were coming from behind, and arguably are still behind in some parts of that. So, we have to not lose the gains that we've made over the last kind of 5 years. I'll say 5 years because that's how long I've been in the job. But over the sort of real shift of emphasis that Peter brought when he joined was to recognise that the part of the operation most challenged at Edinburgh was the student experience, and that was the mission we set out to change. So I hope that we don't see too many things. If I was being very candid about where I think most likely we'll see impact, I think we're going to work really hard to protect services, and we're going to work really hard to protect student supports and so on at school level. I think it's probably your future cohorts will maybe have fewer degree programs to choose from, or a somewhat reduced spread of units or modules or courses to choose from. It'll be in that level of impact, and that may feel challenging for some of a very particular interest, but I think in the main, I'm hoping that it's not too impactful.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's like, as an international student, especially who's coming in now, like if someone's coming in for my degree, they're paying 6,000 more per year. And to come from halfway across the world and then to be told that your student experience is going to be like potentially not the same as it was before can be quite a daunting prospect for a lot of people. But what I want to ask you then is, the University of Edinburgh has prided itself upon maintaining a fixed annual fee for international students, which is consistent. Do you commit to maintaining that over the next?
We haven't talked about not maintaining that. That's That's been our strategy in relation to, we have found that to be an important part and a distinctive part of the offer. And personally, that's where my support would lie.
Yeah.
I think that it gives certainty of planning, because everything else there's a high, apart from the noise in higher education, whether it's here or the US or anywhere. I mean, as you say, it's a daunting decision to make. The more that we can offset that by giving at least certainty on sort of key aspects of that. And I think the fee strategy has been a clever one from our point of view.
In an earlier answer, you said that like the University of Edinburgh has not necessarily like exploited the capacity of tuition fees as possible. Where do you see that ceiling being? Because every year the tuition fee rises more than with inflation, right? And right now, and I know you said privately that maybe the ceiling is about coming up there. What do you think about the ceiling, and where do you think the ceiling lies?
Well, as I said, I think that we've over the last couple of years, I think we recognised. I should say one of my responsibilities is the fee strategy setting committee and the work in that space, and the team there do a lot of work in terms of trying to assess and benchmark. And I would say that the strategy, so at Speak, has been to recognise that we were sitting very much at the expensive end of the UK market, and I would argue there's a dividend. My field in economics is the returns to education, and the returns to Edinburgh are pretty high. So there's an argument that there's a dividend in relation to Edinburgh degree, but whether it was sitting in too rarefied a space is I think something I would have felt we were close to. It's not so much, interestingly, about being sort of priced out of the market. That's my point. I think that wasn't what we were worrying about. I think we were worrying about that we were just looking a little bit out of step with our kind of closest peers. And we've allowed, I think over the last couple of years, we've actually seen their fees rise a bit more dramatically than ours. And that gap has closed. I'm hoping that we move more kind of closely into a sort of a cost plus kind of a fee adjustment kind of regime, and we stay closer to the peer group rather than sitting sort of uncomfortably at the top end of it, which we had been for the last few years.
Yeah. So on that then, Colm, what do you think? How do you think the university can continue to support its international students financially moving forward in an era of financial difficulty? I know there's been talk of establishing an international student scholarship for the past 2-3 years. I don't know if that's in limbo. What's going to happen to hardship funding? Do international students that are coming to Edinburgh can come with the satisfaction of knowing that the university's got their back, helping them financially if they need to, or that's something that's gone?
Again, lots of layers to that question, frankly. I think... Look, I'll say something probably, which I think is, I've said in, and I'll try not to make it sound too economist-like, or if by which I mean sort of heartless marketeer. I think there's a distinction between whether you can afford to be here at all versus dealing with the transient realities of being a student, whether you're international or not. And I think the challenge is in ensuring that when we talk about difficulties confronting students financially, I think it's very difficult for the university to own the fundamental question of, can you afford to be here at all?
Yeah.
And I think we've been probably guilty at Edinburgh of perhaps painting a little bit more rosy a picture or optimistic a picture of what the real costs of being a student in Edinburgh are.
Yeah.
And that has had real implications sometimes for scholarships and things that students have been able to get from their home country, where are based upon local statements of cost and so on. So I think it's very important that we're realistic about what it costs to be here. The fees are one thing, but what it costs to live here. Okay. And that allows students to really make that really hard decision about whether they can afford it.
Yeah.
And then I think our support then has to, I would hope, is about looking more at the flexibility of how we manage things like interruptions of study or periods where students may have to sort of drop out for a period and move away. Very common in other places, less common in the UK and here. And I think if we can move to those kinds of arrangements to give people the flexibility, that would help. One of the plans, for example, in our postgraduate reforms has been around recognizing that the ability of students to sort of stack their credential over a period of time that isn't just constrained by a year is a desirable thing for everybody. And that could be very powerful. I think the second part then is when here, what's a really important message is that is not to sit in silence and recognize that the university they used to be called, and I really hated it, sort of hardship funds. They are a student support fund. We can move pretty quickly overnight or within the same day if there's a really urgent problem. And the sort of things that come up are, unexpected bereavement means I have to travel home and I don't have the resources to do that. And you can talk to us about those things. I fear sometimes that international students think that those resources are not for them. They are very firmly for them. They're for all of our students. And I think in many ways, international students may face more acute challenges, all of which we're open to help with. And we've been trying, and the feedback from anybody watching this we've been trying to make the process as burdenless. It can't be completely burdened. It's money that has to be accounted for. But we're trying to make it as streamlined as possible. And if there's one message on that front, would be international students are entirely appropriate access to that money.
Thank you. I want to shift our focus now to something that's a key factor for international students, which is post-graduation prospects and immigration in this country. Over the past 5 years, the rhetoric from multiple UK governments towards international students has been relatively unwelcoming. Several policy changes, such as the rise in salary threshold for the skilled worker visa, the review of the graduate route visa, the dependence policy, are all clearly aimed at reducing post-study prospects for international students. Now, while we were able to collectively help protect the graduate route visa, I feel as one of the highest number of international students in the UK at Edinburgh, the university needs to take a leading role in standing up for its international students. What is the University of Edinburgh doing to help protect post-study prospects of international students? Can you elaborate on any lobbying efforts with the UK government?
Yeah, thanks. Well, and a great point to make. And I would say that it's really distasteful, to say the least, how governments have, and I see this, as you know, as I said, I worked in Australia for many years, and you can see it there as well, that bundling of international students with the general immigration question is really distasteful. The main route to there's several kind of routes to which we have it. I mean, primarily we work closely as part of Universities UK and the Russell Group. Two Universities UK is all UK higher education. Russell Group are the research intensive elite institutions. Both of them have very strong policies in support of the more flexible approaches to visas and so on. And both of them have very strong lobbying power within Westminster and so on, and use it. So for sure, it may not look as obvious, but as part of the policy framing at UUK and Russell Group, Edinburgh uses its, as you say, its considerable clout in that context. I think at a second level of the organisation, apart from anytime I or the principal get a chance, but our team in Edinburgh Global are close. We've close working relationships with Home Office and so on, and we're part of working groups and policy groups and policy assessment groups and lots of things that go on. So again, the sort of laws of unintended consequences that sometimes come up when the Home Office holders are making that we are a group who are big enough, as you say, to be consulted and talked to. And we certainly make our views known through those more informal networks. I think it's one of those tricky questions, though, where we talked about this before privately around what's in front of the camera and what isn't, in terms of what, when a government has a position, universities have to traverse that quite carefully. And we also have a business interest, to go back to earlier questions. And I think that can be sometimes used against us if we're not too careful. I mean, we would want to argue for the more flexible ranges, wouldn't we? Because we make lots of money out of it, could be seen as a stance. So, we also, again, as a matter of fact, have important relationships such as our role as a kind of a licensee, a provider with the Home Office, and their ability to issue CASs and those things that you'll all be familiar with. So I think it's fair. I would say personally, it is a balancing act, and I think we have to be cautious about where we flex the muscle.
Yeah. Okay. So on that, then, like in January, and I know that the devolved power does not have the Holyrood Parliament does not have ability to legislate on immigration. But in January this year, the Scottish government proposed a Scottish graduate visa, which would allow international students an additional 2 years after the expiry of their graduate visa. What is the University of Edinburgh's stance on this proposal? Do you support it? And have there been efforts that have been made to help the Scottish government bring this to life?
Well, I can't answer the second question. I mean, I think we support the flexible approaches to post-graduation positions generally. And that has been the position we've taken with any of our lobbying. I think from the Scottish Government's point of view, that would be no different. But I'm not aware of direct kind of involvement that we've had with the Scottish Government lobbying. As you say, with it not being a devolved responsibility, it can be, I guess, it's a question of where you invest your energies and times.
Yeah. But the University of Edinburgh would support a proposal.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't see there's no absolutely unequivocal that we see the part of the kind of quid pro quo of the UK and Edinburgh as an attractive destination is a right to have a life here afterwards and build that life.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I would see as the dividend of and that's why, I'm strongly of the view that higher education is an export, is the way my Australian colleagues see it, and see that real value. And it often strikes me that if you looked at Scotland and saw higher education as an export, which, as I said, the Australian government do, we'd be just behind financial services.
Yeah. Okay. That segues well into my next question, because, like you said, the prospect of being able to stay back and work in the UK is a major driving force for international students coming to Edinburgh. Excuse my candidness, but over the past 2 years, the feedback from international students on the career service has often been underwhelming. International students often complain about the lack of cohort-specific support, or often left feeling very dejected by the lack of specific support provided to them. What is your response to this, and what do you think the university can do better to help the career service be to provide more comprehensive support to its international students?
I think the career service themselves are aware of what they have and haven't been able to do, and I guess in part it's a question of their resource is focused on the aggregate student, as you say, rather than cohort kind of questions.
Yeah.
I think I and others would like to see that tailoring, and in fact, international students fall into a category where I think there's others, care experience and so on, where there are very particular kind of issues. So I think there's awareness on the part of the careers team. I guess it's a question of how they use a pretty limited resource to sort of shape the most impact. And I think it is a question that, in a sense, that service is about the average student rather than the kind of the marginal, to use my kind of economic language a bit. So, but I think it's about, this is where I think your role within USA and so on, and the representativeness is important, because I hope we've been receptive to feedback wherever we can. And if there's negative feedback, we need to hear it.
Okay. I'd now like to shift the focus a little bit more on representation and communication, because like you said, feedback is something that's extremely important. And so communication has often been touted as a key problem with this university. Students complain of a lack of attention to detail, are often bombarded with too many emails. This is especially true for international students who feel they remain oblivious about the services that this university has to offer. Firstly, do you accept this as a problem? Secondly, what is being done to change this?
I do accept it's a problem. I mean, I think we've seen an example, not quite our international students, has been recognizing in the last while. So there's been a lot more communicating with students, particularly since the pandemic. And I think I'm probably somebody who feels, you are key owners of our kind of, and parts of our community. And we should communicate, including communicating often at length about things. I often have arguments with our communications team about my long emails and their desire to have short emails. We saw this, for example, in recognizing, almost back to your kind of cohort specific piece, that PGER students have a very particular need for communication and an expectation of a style of communication as a different group. So I think there's part of it is about the different cohorts piece. If I'm honest, I think where we've had problems is in I can think sometimes somebody else thinks somebody else is communicating.
Yeah.
I think that's fundamentally often what happens. I mean, I'm very often happy and want to communicate as me, or increasingly in collaboration with Lucy Evans, our deputy secretary. But schools will tell us that they prefer to do the communication, or the college would prefer to do the communication. And then sometimes the communication doesn't happen. So I think if I was kind of moving in on, I accept the challenge, absolutely. I don't think it has been good enough. And I think the real clarity point is about who owns what communications, and making sure that, because in the meantime, what happens is that there's a gap, and into the gap, no communication falls. So yeah, absolutely agree that it could be better. And I think it's a question of who's going to own communicating best.
Okay. That sort of then builds into representation a bit, because I think it's important to close that feedback loop of thoughts. And we've often spoken about the need to non-mainstream international student issues at this university. Do you feel that the international student voice is reflected enough in the corner offices of Old College where the decisions are made?
I think the student voice is. Whether the international student voice is distinctively heard is a good question. I suspect not. I think Edinburgh has moved hugely, and from being an institution that could be guilty of paying scant attention to student issues or interests, and also to having a very traditional perspective about what students were. When I joined in 2019-20, what struck me was there was already a very substantive international student body here then. Yeah. When you talk to schools, they still were thinking of the UK student as their norm. And I think partly it's the composition of our student body has changed a lot over the last decade, international, but also socioeconomic diversity. And I think separately, we've made very big investments to sort of deal with the, frankly, deficit we've had in student experience. So I think we've done a lot and continue to do a lot in the generic student space. Yeah. I think it's a good time for us to now probably take stock as to whether we need to do more about the distinct student voice that an international body is. Yeah. And I think it's a fair criticism that we haven't done that to date. Yeah.
Okay. So then, Colm, on a personal level, how do you think the university can foster a greater sense of community for international students here? How do you feel, what's your long-term vision for international students at Edinburgh as like a bit of a closing remark? How can the university continue to remain a top destination for international students where experience isn't being compromised upon?
Well, I think what has to be captured by the university more loudly is that what's appealing to me about Edinburgh now is if you walk down the steps of this building out onto the street and look left or right, the streetscape around the university has changed enormously. Like multicultural food, multicultural kind of shops, religious kind of places of worship and popping up all over the place. And I think I would argue a lot of our advertising and kind of pitch to the world is Arthur's Seat and castles. And, look, that's a world that sells, to use that language. Yeah. And we have to accept that. But I find it, for me, I think what's really interesting about Edinburgh is, as an institution, is 50% international. And as a city, and in particular, the sort of the change that brings, it brings a power and a voice and a visibility of international agendas to the city. I don't think we've, my feeling is that if you ask what would I kind of like to see happen, it's that we embrace that much more loudly and visibly, that we see, frankly, different cultures and perspectives portrayed more visibly in our marketing brochures, in our kind of sense of DNA as an organization. And I think that kind of global value of the organisation that we want is not necessarily getting loudly reflected in some of the ways we approach the student body. And I think it really is important, hankering back to the previous question, that we've probably spent rightly, I think, over the last 5 to 7 years, a lot of time on the generic student, and raising that sense to the point when Peter is often accused of not being serious about research because we've been so serious about students, right? So there's a sense in which that means something's good and something must be working. We're now in that point where I think we have the ability to think more cleverly about our identity as an organisation, and I think the international students fit with that.
Yeah. Thank you, Colm. As your international students representative, my role has been to advocate for you, but I know that real meaningful change requires us all, the university, the student leadership, and students themselves, to work together. To all the international students watching, your concerns matter, and we'll continue advocating for the change we need. Please do not hesitate to reach out to your elected representatives if we can be of any assistance. Finally, Colm, do you have anything you'd like to say to the international student community at Edinburgh?
Well, it sounds again quite, cheesy sometimes, but thanks for being here. I mean, it is incredibly humbling, and I mean that, to stand in McEwan Hall on Welcome Week and see, an extraordinarily diverse student body, and then see those students cross the floor of McEwan Hall to graduate. And you are changing this organisation, and we probably have to catch up with your ambitions for yourself in terms of how we embrace that. But thanks for being here. And Aarrnesh is right. I mean, whether to the rep or to me directly, please make sure that we hear the things that are bothering you, because we need to do that. We need to hear them in order to change them.
Yeah. Thank you again, Colm, for taking the time to speak with me today and for your usual candor. Good luck to everyone with exams, and congratulations to all those graduating this summer. Thank you, Colm. Thanks. Appreciate it. Yeah.